The day had started with all the markings of a standard television taping. The studio lights buzzed overhead, the makeup crew did their final touch-ups, and the production staff hustled behind the scenes with clipboards and microphones. The show, known for its playful yet politically pointed interviews with public figures, was set to feature Karoline Leavitt, former White House staffer and rising political commentator, as the main guest. Seated across from her was the show's liberal anchor, Melanie Cross, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for baiting her guests into revealing more than they intended. Her interviews were often clipped and turned viral, not for clarity or insight, but for controversy. She specialized in striking a balance between passive-aggressive charm and outright confrontation. Karoline knew this, and although she had prepared for it, no amount of media training could have foreshadowed how deeply personal things would become. What began as a mild discussion over media bias and cultural values slowly shifted into a battleground. Melanie maintained a steady, sugary tone while pressing Karoline on her beliefs, constantly interrupting, reframing her answers, and attributing motives that Karoline hadn't stated. Every word Karoline said was spun with suspicion, each sentence twisted and repackaged before being thrown back at her with a smirk. The studio audience, a hand-picked group that leaned heavily progressive, chuckled and nodded as Melanie launched into her typical rhythm. It was the sort of performance she had mastered, backed by the illusion of neutrality while quietly discrediting her guests' legitimacy. At first, Karoline attempted to keep her composure, answering with poise and grace, choosing her words carefully, even as her ideas were undermined in real time. But then Melanie said something that shifted the room. It was not a question. It was a statement, delivered slowly, almost with theatrical flair. She invoked Karoline's background, not just her politics, but her upbringing, making broad generalizations about her worldview based on where she was from, who she was raised by, and how she must see the world as a result. It was framed as analysis, but it reeked of condescension. The studio fell quiet for a split second, sensing the shift. Karoline didn't flinch, but something in her posture changed. The cameras kept rolling. What Melanie didn't know, or pretended not to know, was that Karoline had spent years fighting to be taken seriously in rooms just like this. She had built her career inch by inch, facing rejection, scrutiny, and judgment, not because of anything she said, but because of what people assumed about her. And here it was again, under bright studio lights, this time in front of millions. Karoline gave no immediate response. She sat still for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch, refusing to fill it with forced laughter or artificial politeness. For the first time that day, Melanie looked slightly uncertain. That was when Karoline began to shift the tone, not with anger, but with precision. Instead of defending herself, she began dissecting the interviewer's tactics. She calmly outlined how Melanie had constructed a narrative without context, how she had relied on caricatures to challenge ideas rather than engaging with them sincerely. Her tone remained composed, but the weight of her words was undeniable. The crowd that had previously chuckled now sat in contemplative silence. The mood had changed. Melanie, unused to being called out with such clarity, attempted to pivot. But Karoline did not let go. Each attempt to redirect was met with sharp, articulate pushback. Karoline wasn't just answering anymore. She was unmasking. The applause came not from the full audience, but from parts of it that had been quiet, until now. Something had shifted in the room. Even the crew behind the cameras sensed it. But Karoline was not finished. This wasn't about scoring points or proving herself right. This was about calling out the game itself. And the next few minutes would be the turning point. Karoline leaned forward in her chair, the soft glow of the studio lights now casting sharper shadows across her face. The silence had become a weapon, and for the first time during the segment, she wielded it. Melanie's smile had faltered, not fully vanished, but it no longer reached her eyes. Her polished persona began to crack, as Karoline pulled apart her methodical undermining, not with volume or venom, but with undeniable truth. What came next was not a political retort, not a recitation of talking points or a call to ideology. It was personal, and it was real. Karoline spoke directly to the viewers, not in the language of the political elite, but in the voice of someone who had lived under the weight of public assumptions. She revealed the cost of constantly having her character questioned, her intelligence diminished, and her intentions ridiculed, not because she had failed, but because she had succeeded in spaces where people like her were not expected to thrive. The air thickened. Melanie tried to regain control, cutting in with a dismissive chuckle and a patronizing line meant to undercut the momentum Karoline had gained. But this time, the interruption fell flat. Karoline kept speaking, her words gaining traction with every sentence. She reframed the entire conversation, turning Melanie's tactics into a case study of media elitism, one that thousands of viewers could now recognize, perhaps even for the first time. The crowd did not erupt in laughter, nor did it cheer. It listened. Even those who had come expecting a typical dismantling of a conservative guest were no longer watching the usual spectacle. They were watching a shift, an exposure of how controlled narratives could be dismantled by someone simply refusing to play the role they were cast in. Melanie, cornered by her own smugness, attempted to escalate. She brought up a prior controversy from Karoline's past, clearly prepared to use it as a gotcha moment. But Karoline didn't flinch. She acknowledged it plainly, offered the real context that had never made headlines, and then turned the question back to Melanie. She asked why that moment had been pulled up, why, out of everything they could have discussed, it was that one incident which Melanie thought best represented her. She asked who benefited from that narrative and who was harmed. It wasn't rhetorical. It landed like a hammer. Even the camera operators glanced at one another, unsure whether to pan out or zoom in. Melanie, scrambling, turned to sarcasm, usually her exit strategy when pressed too hard. But this time, it only highlighted her defensiveness. What had begun as a controlled interrogation had become a live unraveling. Karoline's energy remained steady, almost surgical. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice, didn't mock. Instead, she calmly laid bare how women like her, those with different values, different upbringings, and different convictions, were constantly spoken over, mocked, and minimized by those who claimed to be inclusive. That was when it happened. Karoline made a statement, not a rebuttal, not a reaction, but a truth so raw that the audience couldn't help but murmur. It wasn't about policy. It was about the way media culture often conflated civility with dishonesty, politeness with silence. She said it in a tone so composed, so clear, that it felt less like an argument and more like a reckoning. Melanie fell quiet. Her usual tricks, interruptions, tone policing, sarcastic barbs, were useless. Karoline had risen above the format, above the edit, and above the trap. She had exposed the blueprint of the show itself. And just like that, the power dynamic flipped. Melanie reached for her cue cards, fumbling slightly. Her posture tightened. The director behind the glass motioned for a wrap-up, but the tension in the room suggested that cutting away now would only confirm what viewers already felt. Something rare had just happened. The guest had taken control of the stage, not by force, but by making the audience realize they had been watching a performance all along. Karoline sat back, her voice calm as ever, now watching Melanie flounder in her own domain. She had not just won the argument. She had dismantled the entire structure it was built on, and she still wasn't finished. As the studio lights hummed and the silence settled uncomfortably across the stage, Melanie was no longer in control. The cards in her hand felt heavier now, the once crisp transitions and rehearsed lines suddenly clumsy and out of place. She blinked a few times, as though trying to recalibrate the tone of the segment, but nothing she said carried weight anymore. Karoline had shifted the gravity in the room. Karoline sat poised, but there was a new fire in her eyes, not of aggression, but of resolve. She had peeled away the artificial decorum and left only the truth. Not a personal attack, but an unflinching exposure of the tactics used to suppress voices that refused to fit a preferred narrative. There was no outburst, no dramatic gesture, just unshakable calm, and it was more devastating than any shout. Sensing she had lost the upper hand, Melanie attempted a pivot toward the show's closing routine, where guests are asked lighthearted questions to end on a playful note. But it landed awkwardly. The tonal whiplash was obvious, even to the audience, who remained unusually quiet. Karoline did not humor the shift. She leaned in again, not to extend the argument, but to finish what had begun. This was not just a disagreement between two people. It had become a televised demonstration of how power operates when challenged by authenticity. Karoline pointed out the precise moment the conversation had been derailed, not by her, but by a refusal to engage in good faith. She calmly explained how the exchange had never been about ideas, but about optics, about creating the illusion, that certain viewpoints were inherently flawed simply because they didn't echo the dominant tone of the space. What made the moment so striking wasn't just Karoline's composure. It was how she illuminated something larger than herself. She gave voice to others watching at home, those who had felt misrepresented or dismissed in similar ways. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was dismantling the scaffolding of false neutrality that shows like this had long used to maintain control. Melanie, visibly uncomfortable now, gave a thin smile. Her voice trembled slightly as she tried to reclaim dignity with a rehearsed sign-off, but Karoline did not flinch or break eye contact. She allowed Melanie to speak, but her presence on the screen remained dominant. Even without words, her refusal to shrink back spoke volumes. The production crew, who had grown used to Melanie wrapping each show with tidy control, now stood behind the glass with folded arms and exchanged quiet glances. They had seen countless guests cycle through this studio, but none had managed to reverse the lens so completely. Karoline hadn't just responded to criticism, she had redirected the focus onto the person wielding it and the institution that enabled it. The network had prepared for a spirited debate. They had not prepared for what felt like a public deconstruction of their approach to storytelling. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about the nature of power, and how easily it is masked by performance. When the credits began to roll, there was no typical cheer from the audience. A few clapped politely, but most sat still, processing what they had just witnessed. It was no longer about who had won or lost the argument. It was about the fact that, for once, the guest had walked into a curated space designed to contain her voice, and walked out having completely redefined the terms. Karoline rose from her chair calmly, thanked the producers with quiet sincerity, and walked off the set without hesitation. Melanie remained seated for a moment, her face frozen in a practiced expression that had lost its meaning. The cameras cut, but the damage was done. Karoline had not only endured the fire, she had absorbed it, redirected it, and left the studio, glowing with a quiet strength that no editing room could diminish. What came next would not be about the show. It would be about what the audience felt. And as clips from the segment began to circulate online within minutes, it became clear. This wasn't just another interview. It was a moment of reckoning. By the time Karoline stepped outside into the cold air, the ripple had already begun. The network hadn't even finished uploading the full segment, yet social media was ablaze. Viewers who had expected another viral takedown of a conservative figure found themselves shaken, unsure of what they had just witnessed. People weren't debating her ideas anymore. They were talking about how she handled herself, how she stared down a system built to diminish her, and dismantled it from within, quietly, methodically, and without compromise. Clips of the exchange, raw and unedited, began spreading. But what struck viewers wasn't a single quote or moment. It was the totality of her poise. Commentators from both sides began acknowledging, reluctantly or otherwise, that something about the segment had broken format. This wasn't a guest melting down or stumbling through rebuttals. This was someone stepping into a trap and refusing to be ensnared. Back in the studio, Melanie sat with the producers in the control room, watching the footage with a silence that had never existed in those walls before. Her team attempted to reframe the narrative, suggesting that Karoline had been overly defensive, that the tone had been too serious for morning television. But those justifications crumbled quickly. The footage didn't lie. Viewers weren't buying the spin. The studio's carefully honed image of confidence and control had been punctured by reality, and that reality had a name. Karoline did not immediately address the media frenzy. She went home, turned off her phone, and allowed the public to respond without her guidance. She didn't need to clarify anything. The truth had been televised, and people had seen it. In the days that followed, think pieces emerged. Some from voices who had previously mocked her, now forced to reckon with the fact that they had underestimated her. Others, more predictably, attempted to discredit her performance by labeling it manipulative or rehearsed. But those claims couldn't compete with the raw footage. People had watched it happen in real time. They had seen the shift, heard the silence, felt the tension break when she took control. It wasn't just that Karoline had stood her ground. It was the way she did it, with precision, empathy, and conviction. She hadn't stooped to the level of personal insult, hadn't lashed out or made a spectacle of the host. She had simply removed the mask of neutrality and let the truth settle like dust. No outrage, no dramatics, just a mirror held to a space that had long gone unchallenged. Meanwhile, Melanie's career faced an unexpected turning point. She remained employed, but her authority as a cultural gatekeeper had been dented. The segment haunted her professionally. Her usual charm felt hollow in future interviews, her confidence undercut by the memory of being calmly outmaneuvered in front of millions. The next time she hosted a guest with opposing views, the audience watched her more carefully, waiting to see whether she would try the same tactics again. Many noticed that she had softened. Less interruptions, fewer snide asides. She had been humbled, not by a scandal, but by being outclassed. Karoline, for her part, emerged stronger. Not by shouting louder or demanding respect, but by commanding it. She began receiving interview requests from outlets that had once ignored her. People wanted to know more, not just about her views, but about her strength. What she did that day had transcended politics. It had become a lesson in how to speak truth into rooms designed to silence it. Her story became less about one moment on television and more about a pattern recognized by viewers around the country, of voices pushed to the margins, not by argument, but by subtle games played with lighting, tone, and selective outrage. She had exposed that mechanism without saying it outright. She had forced it to show itself. In the end, it wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It wasn't even about Melanie. It was about truth, dignity, and the quiet power of refusing to bend. Karoline had walked into a machine designed to grind her down, and instead, she held up a mirror that showed its cracks. She did not destroy her opponent. She simply reminded everyone watching what it looks like when someone refuses to play a rigged game and wins anyway.